Good morning. We want to welcome everyone online for joining us and just make a brief announcement in that next Saturday's class, April 9th, will be at a different time. It will be at 1 p.m. Pacific time. That's a one-time thing to allow for wonderful events that are happening there at the center where our teachers are. So we'll begin with our recitations. Everything you will need from online, you will find in the chat box.
To the teacher endowed, transcendent destroyer, one thus gone, foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one God to bliss, knower of the world, supreme God of beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, to you, the Buddha endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I'm supreme in this world. To you, poor wise, then I bow, with pure bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme signs, face like the spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not, incomparable wise one, to you I bow. A great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings. The holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn out Meru, fallen sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offer to you, may all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayame. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Oh yeah, what's weird? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, can't do it. Punzo Kelly Chie Trimbeco, Tayan Roa, Song Malu Shishin. Punzo Kelly Chie Trimbeco, Tayan Roa, Song Malu Shishin, Sigbe too. Shajaso de la Cosa. Oh yeah. That Rajutare Churchival tells Combe, then you would think Caberson to become the Roa. And Joachima Hadami Koba, the Chima Chimani Chima Hadami Koba Churchival to get it. Roa. Many shallow saw up on Bata, Pembatrubata, Chimbachurin Sabala Sobala, Sunday. Rimgi. Haru de Chimbatu, Tarchimbe, Sanji, Koban, Bochichin, and Tobarsha. Techeto, Tambechu, San Yambecuno, Le Percent Tamne, Sel Tamne, Sambershus, or Techila.
So right now, we have attained this state with all of the sort of leisure and opportunity to be able to practice the Dharma. And on this occasion, while we have this kind of life, we should work toward having again in the future a good rebirth as a human or a god, doing so by abandoning harming other beings and working for their benefit, so that we might, by gaining a good rebirth after good rebirth, work toward this goal of Buddhahood by culminating, by sort of perfecting our practices of the various like generosity and ethics and so forth. And in order to do that, we are going to then listen to the Dharma. So with that kind of motivation, setting such a motivation, thinking that we are doing this for ultimately being able to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings, we are listening to these teachings.
Oh, yeah, because I'm going to need to do I need the lens?
No.
Or to what I'm going to do the way. Oh, dear, but take Conanilla Shelwa, take Conanilla Baba Baba so. Any comji, Mibal, Comda, Candre, Mibacare, and then number Carisha, Comdu Caracum Silver.
Dire.
Candre.
Lare dire. Ta Migyu kareres. Migyu dang nampa.
Oh, yeah.
100.
Oh, Disha. Oh, Tatitera, Casura. Sanjay Sumbe, Sunrap Tamjera. Any Tongbani Nezu Tardu de Toyach Songuara, Chesonade. Tarba Tobeche Songuara. Tindeko Nelu Tardu de Mashin Bewangi, Qua Corgiora. Tindeko Nelu Tardu de Togbeche Chesonguara, Sanjay. Tindu Sanjay Sumbeche, the Jetamje Medaba, Sakjetamje Tungawa, Sumbatabude, de Konani Cholapa, Tiache Songuares. Songrab Nala Metabada, Tungawa Sumbatu and reach to the Sungutwa. Tinibati, any Ame Rabat and Barwa, Ranget to be Sayita Mebas in it, Ranget to be Sayita Meba, Pumbulet and Shembeta Mebasero, Takbachibu Rawachi Yita Mebasero, oh, dear Rabba, Dami Rabat Debatu, 대 코나니리아 아니 슈베치도 타니부 발레베치도 송거레시라 전에 다음에 참모 땀바도 땅바니를 소바도 땀바도 다음에 타두디 땀바라 레바레스 송에되니 타두베 땅바니 내로 타두디 땡겨 레시라 어딘데 산제가 송베 송라 탐제 대코나니를 집에 탑수 송바다 대코나니를 슈바 타니부 슈베체도다 대코나니리아 타르토도 봐 대코나니데 고예체도 송거요레 송바샤다레섬 대솜나라 드바레섬 드바들라 미네 미기어도 산제 송라라 미네 아니 대 상마 탐제 티나라 드바레섬 넘버 드바디샤네 텔레섬 내기어라 그래서
아니 디 타가랑라 주 디 체바 체고르베
아
디 주곰 로와
드바식도 아가주 편한 디제 탐제 풍부의 날 드바식도
no
디제 탐제 풍부의 날 드바레 풍부의 날 만두베요 말와 어디나 시상제 송베 송럽 제조야 대코나니리아 치에체도 송바다 대코나니를 타니불레베다 대코나니를 것을 레베체도 송바 대송분할 드바레섬 산제 송럽 탐제 미샤 대상마 아니 대송날 드네 송바레섬 대송나 추드바들 미겨라
no
배는 아주 디제 탐제 메다바 동야 말 디제 탐제 수초아 디시 넘버 세바 응날 드바레섬 야텔 샘샤야도와 어디나 시야 드도와
no. So here we're going to first address some questions that came up a few weeks ago that we didn't have a chance to get to. So the first of these is from the section that we covered earlier, I'll say. It seems that the idea that all the Buddha's teachings lead to suchness is a meditation object for developing serenity. So would you please explain the focal object and aspect for this meditation object and how one would meditate on it? So here, this was as we had earlier in the text, it says, the yogis who are interested in actualizing a serenity mind should initially concentrate closely on the fact that the 12 sets of scriptures can be summarized as all leading to suchness, that they will lead to suchness, and that they have led to suchness. So here, there's a kind of understanding that one needs to have, looking at the fact that all of the teachings of the Buddha are for the purpose of being able to realize emptiness, or for the purpose of attaining liberation. And so they are for us to be able to realize suchness, or realize the ultimate reality, the actual nature of things. And so in order for that to happen, we can see that teachings like the four seals, like all compounded phenomena are impermanent, and all of that is suffering and so forth. These are methods by which one is led to finally understand that the sort of more subtle selflessness, or this idea of emptiness. So we see that those kinds of teachings sort of point to, or take one, lead one toward suchness. And we can see also that the teachings on more coarse forms of selflessness, wherein it is taught that there is not a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, or no self that is a singular, autonomous, permanent kind of entity. These coarse levels of selflessness are for the purpose of being able to turn disciples toward realizing eventually that kind of ultimate reality. And so we should recognize that these various types of teachings, and finally those that actually teach subtle selflessness, that are really directly pointing at emptiness, these are all methods for disciples to be able to be led towards suchness, or enter into and understand suchness itself. And so these are what are summarized within the Buddha's teaching. So once we have sort of come to that understanding, we place the mind directly on that all of the teachings of the Buddha, all that's summarized in the Buddha's teachings, are really for that purpose of attaining suchness. And one places the mind on that kind of recognition or understanding.
Oh yeah, vegetarian kumya mambudoa. Then come pumbunga, vegetarian come chobye serba. Tezu tambu re shemba chigiwara. Dire sam. Dina dubare sam cheba chigiwara. Cheba chasan, duche sama tamje. Da pungbunga nala dugido asam. Chö tamje kichi chungi nala dubare sam. Tila sam jogiwara. Tambu re cheba che. Ani chima de tati nal chö tamje dugido asam. Chiniba. Chötazulia, Dina, Dire, Tetam do Sebare, Tilla Lagba Mendoa, some Tagara, Resha, Setimado Mendo, some Gura. Chitawa to Jabachidusa, oh, Chuganelu, Dire, Dele Tartu Benelu Mendo, Terra Nelu Taduresha, some the same Jogua, or Tina Shit and the Telea, some Joguara. Tessumbinala Dubare, some Dusha, some Dubala Mini, some Joguara. That did it.
No. So this is also like the way in which we recognize that all phenomena are contained within the 5 aggregates, or those 12 sense bases and their objects, those 18 categories of phenomena. We go through initially looking at each one of them and then come to the conclusion, well, all phenomena are contained within or summarized within those aggregates, and then place the mind on that understanding. So when we are looking at the teachings of the Buddha, we can investigate individually that there are various teachings that say teach the conventional, but that's just the conventional nature of phenomena. It doesn't get at the ultimate nature. And so recognizing that all of the teachings of the Buddha are for being able to come to an understanding of that ultimate nature, recognizing that one then places the mind in that kind of understanding. And this is how it is a serenity meditation.
Oh, yeah, this matter. The Lamri Chamunala Sungudoa, Surab Chamatam Jeti, Sumnala Duty, tell us some jogba or Sungudoa, Duty, tell us some jogba. Oh, what do you do that? Me work Harrison, Sanjay Surab did them be Surab, Jetam Jemeda, Tembada, then did them by the Tombatem, but the Surab is some still Miguara. There's some Surab Tamjegi, so doing it, thank you, or some tubal and me. Same job, number shared it, two better shag. Oh,
So here it also explains this in the Lamrim Chenmo, that all of the Buddha's teachings are sort of summarized, summed up in these baskets of teachings. So when we are doing this kind of meditation, one is observing that sort of like that the teachings are contained or that they are summarized in that, and one places the mind then on that object. It's sort of come from a kind of investigative understanding, but then one is placing the mind. 남장이나 다 샘드렐 잡어 샘드렐 용기나 남장 잡어 용기나 가래 제거래 탑식 가래 제거래.
그래. 다 샘드레스도 가래 샘드레데 가래나 뒤하고 그러다고. 샘드레 가래 돌치기나 아니 뒤딜 좀 배신이 먹어라. 근데 동반이를 지 공부해나. 동반이 공부 건진나기 주어라. 오늘 소소 풍부할 때는 소소 때시도 다 소소 남기나 심도 샘드 진나기 해요라. 근데 얘네야 그 땡진 대바리 좀 삼글 송고도 다 자원에 매번 말에 풍부할 땡진 대대 개vel에 상게 미개vel에 상게 대완용게 동행용게 여래 삼제 야 예배철 삼당 거라. 다팀에 샘데 미개버라 된동소나 땡인지 참다제네 소소 감다 팀에 삼당 거를 우주 마자 송고도 샘미개버라 샘류다 샘라 내버쳐나 우주 때문에 꿈에요 말해서 에티다가 샤네 트레딩체제코 샘고양 붙이지 샤고래 송고도 김만도 다 샘레 가리나 샘미기바르 가리나 뒤차네로 차도를 붙이지 녜매치지 있는데 그 차도 맞아지 차도 그게 좀 Saba Congo Batachi, Condo, Yungutuno, Tinde, Saba Miki Bakari, Sony, Guinati, Doctor de Samutangora, Tinyambo Yungura. Oh, yeah.
Nice. So then the second question that we had was what to do when anxiety arises while one is meditating. So here, Geshe is saying that it's important to understand sort of what is the source of our anxiety? Why is this coming up? So we could have a situation like, say, you're meditating on emptiness, and that kind of strong sort of negation that comes in the course of meditating on emptiness leaves one with a kind of fear or anxiety. And in that case, one would want to then meditate on the sort of side of existence of looking at how things are dependently originated. So one isn't completely non-existent, but rather there is an undeniable sort of conventional level of dependent origination. And in that way, contemplating that helps to balance out the kind of anxiety that arises from meditating on emptiness, potentially. So, but if it's a case where we're like having some sort of worry or fear, anxiety come up that we need to maybe address, it's better maybe to get out of that meditation and actually address whatever's going on in our mind, because it's not good to sort of force ourselves to continue to meditate. If we're experiencing some kind of difficulty or body or mind, we shouldn't force ourselves. Rather, leave it for a little while and come back to it once we've addressed it. But it also depends, again, on what is arising in our mind. So if we have, say, jealousy coming up or anger, we need to work up with a specific antidote to that particular affliction. So it's important to kind of identify what is it that we are anxious about, and then be able to work with that, whether it's taking a break from our meditation or using the proper kind of antidote.
Oh, that patient didn't matter. Oh, yeah, that is. That didn't matter. Chivalry did it.
Digre.
Yeah, that is. Oh, yeah, Tangan Zukaresana. Ta Kangdar, Tingy Comdu Zarwa, Tingy Comdu, Loba Kasore, Kuyangbo, Rabsiche, Seda Suna, Chese, Kalekana, Tradition Kumbu Mara, Labo, Tabada, Kawada, Keva Sambuin, Samsa Kawa Comde, any pass, Comia, Comduta, Kalekabu Chotona, Tipa, Shache, Semblabo, Cheche, Shower, Uzu, Jabja, Calendar, Capture, Sambu Mara. Chundru Sora, Chundru, Songan Kela, Toa was a Kewala Jude, Toa, Jube Kabla, Toa, Rawa, Tichela, Ataya, which also some Comja, Tinde, Kebasam, which also Paxa, was out also some Kawacom the Shah with Songuda. Oh, this Kalakando comes the Shana, and it's a Macum Jani Drogumara, Jassin some Gira, or Lulu Semba, Bantu Bache, Comja or Mother Uzu Shidachamna, Semba True and Yankawada. Oh, do you got soda? Well, yeah.
So again, in terms of working on meditative stabilization, when we are doing this practice, we need a relaxed and open kind of a mind, one that recognizes that this is a fortunate opportunity and has a kind of joy in engaging in meditation. If we're having a great deal of difficulty and we really aren't able to do it well, maybe it's better for us to leave it for some time rather than try to force ourselves, make ourselves continue to engage in this practice when it's actually not beneficial in that way. So as we talk about this, we need joyous effort, and joyous effort or enthusiasm comes from really having a joy in that practice. So we should be approaching this with the kind of attitude of this is a very fortunate opportunity with a relaxed and open mind. Because if we're engaging in this kind of forceful way where we're making ourselves do it, we're actually less likely to want to do it again in the future. It can become an obstacle to continued practice.
Oh, yeah. I don't know, somebody make you in a carina. Mangsha, Jignature, Yungra. Send it on that, Jignature, that in this some Cornelia, Samba, make you a younger. Oh, tea and deco. Samba needs a change of some sober, Kawa, Kade, Comna, Com. And she Namsaji, Dogma Medrach, Namsaki, some any chilola, Dogma Medrach, the year some certain, Nam to thank you, Amara. so similar you are down to the down chilo namju de namju nashi chidang nashi chidogora dumba jula ransor sha sungudwa similar ya jura down to the chase chilo kunju de samba che yingji ke some medam rachidane medusan medicine but medusam girwa kozo na do mare it is on dumba jula ransor sha chi kunju de chidang nashi dagora condition and number mavis ya do it.
So really, when it comes to meditating, if we are sort of unhappy or have some kind of mental disturbance, this is generally coming from having the 8 worldly concerns, from being caught up in those kinds of worldly activities. And so here, when it comes to really working on our mind, we are working on that sort of aspiration or attitude that we have, whether we are generating love and compassion or other positive sorts of attitudes and virtues. It's not really about the kind of external change in our behavior, but really the change in the way that we are thinking, the change in our mind. So it's not as though the sort of external expression or attitude that we put forth is going to have the dramatic change, but it's really about the sort of internal work on our own mind. And that's what should be the focus of our practice.
Oh yeah, 당한 저 계속 로차르데 데레신 로사 최지 담에 제시해서 최지 담에 세도다 치료 더도 마두 봐야 돼. 최지 담에들 타라르시 니셰기도 지디 치료 소자테로를 살아서 봐 풍부면에 소다 아니 계지 중인안에 소다 저주 강가 감초변에 소여와 소자테로를 살아서 봐요라 어디서 강가데 치료네 수 여네 수 차다시 말해서 소소 섬기 박사세베 섬기 당이 섬레서도 수다지는 송진 참에 좀 세워라 섬시도 섬기 가르쳐 수집에 참아셔라 넘버 10쇼라 어디다 당이 찍버려서 대비 내봐야 세두산치 통용거 얼마도 치료를 여버지 수 여네 통고요 말해서 거라 Milam Nashiris, Milam Dengopsang Azu Sudameda Shagdua, the Chilone Yomada Shagdua, Suzu Semgi Nawaremado, Basha Sebe Nawaremado, Chilo Yomara, in a Chilo Yobanashi, Tongutua, or Tinashi, Draw to Simjeto to Ranrange, Lady Wange, Candidates Tongu Nati, Basha Sebe Wange, and the Yundam in the Tongu Yormato, Vidi Chilo Yobati Kangi Chibichi Ganges to Toya Yomarese. Chilo is some Ranzimbe, Semale, Ranzimbe Namshes, Semale, Zatade, any Chilog, Shibe Toya, Yomares, Chilog is Toya Sudu, Sembi Tangi, some days, Sembi Tangshi days, Semda Chachik, but days, Sungura, teacher Roswa, or the Indico, Chiri Semle, Ranzimbe Semle, Zatade, Chiri, so. La soba yo mare so ya de chide me so gora de sem jambe tawashira ane nejo chebe omaranji ba ge te khelen gora tan dode chebe omaranji ba to so yene ya dode ba ge chiru yes khelen gora ba jo de so yo re sem yo so yo re do so ta te re cha kan ge chilo yo re ti so number sha ne on bol star ane sheben ge yo re se chiru yo ba de dode ba khelen gora dode chebe omaranji ba to so ya chiru Yoba Kaligora. Umatanju Agulula Chiri Yore. So that the Rajala Soba Sambitani, Mara Koran Pajol Yore. The Yoba Deni to similar charge Tongu Yore Sungura. Or teach you Lamna.
So as for where we had left off then in the text, we had been looking at the selflessness of phenomena. So meditating on the selflessness of phenomena here means really in particular, first we looked at the way in which we grasp at external things like the form that is form, sounds, smells, taste, touch, that which which is contained within the 5 aggregates, or we can talk about it in terms of those 18 constituents, the sort of form that is included within those. So again, it says phenomena in short are included under the 5 aggregates, the 12 sources of perception, and the 18 aspects. And so here, these are not in the nature, they don't have any sort of real external existence, but rather are only something that is in the nature of mind. So when we examine and look for these kind of external phenomena, we can see that they are nothing other than aspects of the mind. So we have this mind of valid cognition apprehending phenomena, and we can speak of the sort of existence of that mind, but the object that it apprehends is like that of a dream. In a dream, we perceive things as though they were external, real objects of our forms and sounds and so forth, but they don't have any real external existence. They're only in the nature of that perceiving mind. And so the 6 types of beings, these beings that cycle through various realms, we see and encounter various objects due to the kind of awakening of predispositions that have been laid down on that consciousness. And so there's nothing substantially different than the apprehending consciousness. We can't find any sort of external existence apart from that perceiving mind. So here, this is expressing the view of the mind-only school, the Chittamatra, as well as a view that is espoused by the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka. So they would say that there is no external existence apart from the mind. There's nothing that one can point to as having external existence. Whereas when we look at the kind of view of the Sutra school, Svatantrika Madhyamaka, so this is the autonomists that are following the Sutra school, they would, like the Sutra school, assert that there are external phenomena, that we can point to and identify external phenomena. And the Prasangikas as well, they would assert that there are also external phenomena. So here, where it is saying that there are no external phenomena, they're only in the nature of mind, is expressing the mind-only kind of view. Again, Kogimindu. Ke Kogiminduwa?
다 거기도 왜?
단다 Kogidu.
야야. 다단다 치리 요 말에 sem게 당니 삼레 송게 시워라. 어디 그 르바디 가르 주센지 요거라 주센 거기 와라. 가르스는 칠로그 유이지 요나시고라 뒤도 주바디 칠로를 요나시고라. 아니 치리를 또베 송아스도 유이들바 집바스도 셈들바 대진베 셈데시고라. 치리를 또베 송진 자신 거바스라. 송아 유소대다 송진 메시스라. 자다 전진 연시서 랑진베 참마서라 남시들. 제타데 요 말에서 제직에서 오라 칠로를 다 소도 요 말에 소소 셈비 박사세베 나오래 송거라. 다들 주생 거기와라. 셈게 나와서 멤버체 칠로네 좁게 요나시거라. 치르주소 요나시거라. 치르주소 거베르바 마보요래 셈잠벨로라. 다 되는 가지 찍랍나. 되게 가서. 니슈바 뒤참면 거베르 버스. 니슈바 요라 빼제메라. 니슈발이야. 뒤참면 거베르 바시오라. 디날 가르친 것은 죽이 지자리 자로 나서래. 죽 장가 주라. 기대 뒤지시 아니 초실이 뒤르르르체 땡레체체 올리체체 주르라. 죽이 지자리 자로 나서 뒤뒤체 춘주 기대 직체 아니 초실이 시체 땡다 오체 콜레 투스나시거라. 죽이 지자리 자로 나서 내 직체 anything was in the Sutusuna, Drugi Chichar Charwana, Tarab Tucha Children Urusera. Gig do Tarab de Gide Yebe do Tarab de Chatul and Rover de Sura. Garrison, Yella Tuba di Chachira, give Yola Tugumarwa. Yola Tuba Chadi, Yella Tugumarwa, Dijoli Chadi, Del Tugumarwa. Anything there, oh, the Chatu or this wara, the Chatu yorwa. Chatu man, any patim do rako. The next two lips on the Kuni Chikbachagra. Shana lips on the Chikbachal, Hona Lemna, the Tenel, and the owner Chikchandra. 아니 그 뒤쳐를 두고 말와. 어제데 두기 지쳐 자와나 처럼 뒤쳐 두도 차 두고 그래. 딜레 투베 차치 딜레 체베 차치 데데 체베 차데 딜 두고 말은 딜 두게 차데 딜 두고 말해. 처럼 뒤쳐 두도 요로 쳐라. 두고 다자 고책 나서 두디 바 템도나 샬라 예베 뒤디 추요니 코 샬라 베 템도 그랬으나 샬라 테 누글라 테 코치바르네 기도 치바르 아니 쳐를 두고 말와. 뒤까지 망부콜 투스네 쳐를 두고 말고 쳐를 두고 내 파조 마두부제 가가자니 쳐르러네 잠불이 잠거와 뒤 첨부 잠거와 어디인데 두기 지저 자와나 처럼 뒤쳐 두도 줄스 두고 다장 고책 나서라. 두고 대배 고사 찍자니 냠도 끼기 뒤들 파팀 소나스고라. 샤네 뒤지용 뒤팀네 샤라 레벨 홀라 레벨 노브제 간거 찍바 차수나 너고 쳐를 줘야 요 말와. 처럼 뒤쳐 두도 두고 다장 고사 찍바 고사 쳐로 하지 미세 고사 드레소나 뒤까지 태나 끼기 뒤들 파 드레제 셔나 네 공부한 두제 잠도 전에 콜 공부 벤 잠불레나 시고 뒤첨부지나 레레레 템나 셔르치엔 줘야 말다고 따라할 대샤그라 뒤는 잠불레 잠 토고 말에 뒤첨부 차 토고 말에 락바 차 토고 말에서 어떻게 되자고 실로게 유유나 수도 뒤도 치료도 조고요나 고총으로 단전이 총수유지 일렙소나 바로 질레 차 매배 뒤질레 토야고 그래서 뒤토야 요 말에서 뒤가르서 섬래야 차도 차 옆에 뒤지마도 뒤리야 차 매배 섬래 차려 요 말에서 거라 차 매배 뒤지 요나 아니 뒤간거 쳐도 요 말은 전부린 차 토고 말에서 거라 어쩌래 저기 시절 자와나 처럼 뒤쳐 줘도 요러 조구 다자 고직나 공부한 두전 점도 요러세 어딘데 르바타네 치료를 소요 말에 섬기는 차례에서 치료 장장을 요나 고총을 총총을 아니 자네 고시게도 맹게질 토우리데 토야요 말에서 뒤연하는 점불이 좀 토고 말에 뒤쳐쳐도 말에서 그거라 어디지 람나 인도다
第一念是吧？
아
一念，你说把的
니슈바 어데 니슈바래 아 로비니 자래
So here then, in terms of establishing that there are no external phenomena, one needs to give a reason. So here for the mind-only school, they present different kind of reasons why it is that we can't have this kind of external existence. So we have a perceiving mind, like when we have a mind apprehending, a visual consciousness apprehending form, there is the aspect of the apprehended, meaning that external form, and the aspect of the apprehender, or that apprehending consciousness. And they would say that those are actually not substantially different. They're of the same nature or essence, because we can't establish that there is any kind of external form. If things were established as existing externally, as having that kind of existence, then the following sort of problems would arise. This is just one particular reason as it's laid out in Vasubandhu's 20 verses. And here again, he's presenting a mind-only kind of position. So I'm not sure I'm going to get the verse exactly right here, but the thrust of the verse is saying that if it is the case that you are trying to assert that there is some sort of truly existent external kind of particles, well, there's no way to posit the smallest kind of particle, which would in essence be a partless particle. Because if you have that kind of situation of a partless particle, then how can we talk about things coming together? So here, if it's the case that we are unable to say distinguish between the left side of something and the right side of something, that's what it would mean for it to be partless. You don't have any further kind of distinctions to make. Well, then how can those kinds of particles aggregate together? If we're going to talk about particles coming together, you have like 6 directions. You have, northeast, southwest, above and below. And those are the ways in which those would need to connect together. But if it's the case that we're saying that these things don't have any parts whatsoever, whatsoever, how can you have like, say, any kind of conjoining between them? Because there's nowhere for them to touch. If you're asserting that there is no sort of particle, like there is no part to that smallest particle. So if you don't have like, say a right side or a left side, how can we talk about some other particle coming and conjoining with it? They would actually sort of like dissolve into the same space, would become a single thing. There would be no way, if you can't distinguish, say you have got your center partless particle, well then there needs to be some way that it is connected with another particle. Is it at the top, the bottom, the north, the south, the east? If you can't make that kind of distinction, they're basically just collapsing, dissolving into a single space, into a single place. And if we don't have that ability for them to like connect or touch in some kind of a way, when they come together, they're basically just collapsing into one space because they're partless particles. Then how could we possibly talk about the aggregation of such particles to create bigger physical things? So if all sort of, if we're talking about like 6 particles trying to conjoin are actually just going into the same spot, there's no way that you could have a larger particle. And so too, on the other hand, if you can't create that kind of aggregation of particles and create any sort of larger form or more coarse objects, then those sort of coarse things, we would also have to say, well, those are then the smallest particles. We can't have this kind of external existence because, as they've undermined here, we can't have a kind of a partless particle that's somehow able to conjoin or aggregate with others. And so even those kind of larger things, how would they be built up if they can't be an aggregation of these kinds of particles? So here, this sort of, when one is trying to find the smallest kind of external existence, it becomes like of infinite regress. One can't get to a point where there is such a smallest particle.
Oh yeah, 당미셰드자 풍부단 찍다 타데 좀 주바세 라we 다데 풍부단 찍도 요 말에 타데도 요 말에 세셔서 어디 셰드자 코텔이야 바세 게데 풍부다에나 깨단 집배찬데 주르시제 네지 주시셔서 주된서 가데스네 게데 풍부다에는 풍부가데 다레서나 풍부가데 다레서나 아니 다 망부타기로 왔지 하고도 안 하죠. 티 롱장한 텐데 지금 말한 직den기 타녀베 삼루 땅땅을 찾는 뉴그레스라 직den베 타녀베 셰바게 삼루 땅땅을 찾는 뉴그레스가 텔 롱잡 텐데 장치 텐데 지금 말에 다 셰두선 롱난 텐데 셰셔셔요라 이제 뭐 두고래 직den베 지단 타녀베 챵마게 삼루 땅땅 가지고 하고 했잖아. 풍부하게 다이나 아니 다음에 장아 차그라 소보 다르 심다르 초드면 장아 차그도 다만부터 완두도 아니 풍부하게 다이나 풍부랭게 강사데 렘바부 다데 켈랑벌 전담도 풍부랭바부 겨알렘바부 다데 켈랑벌 전다요 말아 랑제 풍부하게 다르데도 이 렘바부 켈랑벌 때메레샤라 아니 풍부하게 다이나 니와 렘바보다 가서 렘바보다 랑제 레니데 치바레도서 레다 치바부 찍든지 왔어도 레다 치바부 찍든지 왔어 렘바보다 라워르샤베 레 풍부하게 찍으려더라 좀 연구도 한테는 신 풍부하게 신대 풍부를 차는 소소 소보도 사도 주버와 밤에 구달할 때는 소보사도 들어가대. 예를 때는 멕시코지 초아 나베 자전에 초아 대화 동해를 소보태서 콜루부르도 대체될 들어가대. 라와도 sendel을 들어 라와도 가도라. 소보데 sendel마도 sendel에 샤거마도 균튼이 심마 두고 말아. 다른 시켜왕 아마게 풍부하게 다래져라. 뒤에 교왕함에 소보데 다래 속불을 때문에 초알을 소버텨서 다이나 교황하면 속보대 주인인데 로마로와 교황하면 속보대 다이나 되게 개회 내사하기로 와 속보통에 개회 내사기라 개회 내사서놓고 남민 대부분 요에 매래 내 제바 취소해봤으기라 교황함에 속부대다 속부를 때문에 미기 시번님도 좋아 나의 시번님도 좋아요 알아봐 아니 대조 강가 데려오라 가서래 좋아도 다래되어라 다네 되게 내 사바디 쳇들이야 저만남이 녀예요 말아 그 쳇들 좋아라 속부대 레르마도 속부 괜찮니 다네시 녀예요 말아 내 제가 출시로도 속부도 다네는 속부 개가 전에 내 사바디 저분이 저가 녀예요 말아 그 출시잖아 그래 속부 좋아라 저마요 말아 내 제가 출시 맞제보다 tre봐서 쳇디 속부대야 다래되어라 다래되어라 이게 동해 녀예요 봐 신대 류지 동해 용도 다가 동해 양교라 신대 류딩에만 레사요 말와 신대 류딩에만 요 말와 신대 류딩에만 레사요 말아 단단 밤에 고달데 사바 주거라 아니 그래 마셔봐다 쳐버려 그 레게 사요 말에 그 다래 동해 용교라 내 마셔봐다 쳐버시기도 드니티나시 산제다 미망부 깨와타요 봐 산제 망부 송구도 되는가 대세 대대다 개부치지 주라 예 송구도 깨와타에 매버샤 그래서래 소보다래서나 네 소보다네 마 대세 대대다 미티 속을 줄세요 말와 속을 사바사잔래라 이메 규 말와 진짜 나게 나 대세 대대네 진짜 유로섬 깨와타에 매래서 그러나 신들이 중에 속보다 속볼 때문에 좋아하다 저저 강가 사바 들리 중어라 뒤 균가만 요 말와 다르듯이 내가 대세 대되는 지지 줄이스 근데 유르게 단다 될레베시라 내가 속보대 술레게 요 말와 속볼 때문에 좋아도 레베 요 말도 단다 봐도 그래서 그 깨와 tempo 밑에 봐시 너지 쭉 당기도 어디 인도자 다 거던다디 고규게 말은 삼로다나 공간주 참매 주다 주를 돈에 봐 세부세 토고도 와 민주 토그제 공유송 토도 봐도 야부지 세 토고 와래 띠 야부지 내고 와라 다디 풍불이야 라왜 다 주요나 내지 풍부다 지그래 타대래세 지기는 내지 쭉청소 다 타대에나 저기 풍부남래세 우체니 매버졌다 그 생각도 뭐 보셔야 봐 아니 소부대다 다니디 배카가이나 저기 풍부남래 제 풍부체니 매버죠 아니 풍부기 진지 제가 자와셔야 간가 다가 진지 제발 누구면도 그 라마에 뭐 타대로 소소소 가가라 다게 자와셔야 방안 자와셔야 누구 말어 라바 예배 자와셔야 예배 자와셔야 누구면도 진내시 다다 류니 라와도 주베 소소에 있는 거 타대이나 봐. 내 풍부 전이 낀지라 소바 소와 되돌아 소바 남시게 지시 마실라 소바 저저 강가 잡아서부터 다 잡아서 좀 말아. 내 다들 내가 시에 매게 차래. 시르바이나 다들 싸워 보이서 롱줘봐 보이서 거라. 되돌아 롱줘야 매버된 도라. 그 잡아지 요 말은 좀더 가야지 요 말아. 어디 인도 가서라. 가려서다. 껴와 tempo 밑에 봤어. 테니까서 풍부의 셴바이나 어디 그저 풍부남을 풍부천이 매버려 아니 다딱봐 뱀에도시 뒤도녀에 매버지려 가게 매치기서 되게랑 벌떠다 그요 말아 어텐데 다 주여버이나 그 풍부송알라 마더니 가가 송주요 그래 뛰어 말해서 그라 배 풍부간에 배 로가로서 라고 다 주나 아주 당은진지도 야는 소보르지나 심저지나 초아르지 차네 아니 다시 응원지부도 풍부송알라 마저버 당외 송주여 그래서거라 띵외 송주여 말했어 띵외 송에요나 속벌 때는 골 때는 락벌 때는 강벌 때는 그다 차고면 도와서 다 가려인 바디 커둘봐 문진지야 여고로 와서거라 원부 세븐나 싫어와 원부 코랑 통해요라 세브 통해요라 락바 예바 통해도 연부 로가 통해도 락바 예바 통하라 야 연벌 때는 송고요 말와 자꾸 태가를 송구로 해서 나라도 땅은 이제 다다도 낚시 찔릴 때는 낚시 풍부 찔릴 때는 바다하고도 뛰다하고 말해서 그라 때네 딱배 지시 자세 그런 가에 뭐데 거둘량 건지 저고 그래서 진짜지 송송한 풍부 남래 생이나 근데
So last time when we had been explaining, or earlier when we'd been explaining the selflessness, particularly selflessness of the person, we had been talking about the kind of faults that would incur if the person is essentially the same as the aggregates, essentially one with the aggregates, or if it's essentially different from the aggregates. So there are, as it's sort of listed out in the Lamrim Chenmo by Gelama Tsongkhapa, these 6 kind of faults that would occur if one were to assert that the self and the aggregates are essentially the same. So the first of these is that it's sort of like if these two are intrinsically or inherently the same, then there's no point in even asserting a self. So if it is the case that the aggregates and the self are exactly the same, it would be redundant to talk about a self. It's just like a synonym for the aggregate. And again, so just to step back, when we are going through these various reasonings, this is something where, yes, there's scripture that is cited, but we really shouldn't be thinking in terms of like going to a recited scripture. We can establish this for ourselves using reasoning, using worldly conventions and reasoning and thinking through this. We can actually come to an understanding of these various topics. We don't need to think that we should just be resorting to going to scripture to establish this. We think through these and we can logically establish it for ourselves. So if it were the case that we say we're to assert that the aggregates are the self, well, then there would be the second fault, that the self would become multiple. I mean, think about it. We have form and feelings and consciousness and discrimination and karmic formations. Well, then is our self 5 different things? Even within each of those, like our consciousness, we have different minds. And so which is the self? The self would then become multiple. And so that's the second kind of fault that would incur. And then there is the fact that if the aggregates were the self, then it really, sorry, this was sort of as it was, as I mentioned the first one, there's no point in talking about the appropriated and the appropriator. If it is the case that the one doing and the doer and the deed are the same thing, you can't separate out an action and an actor if they are essentially one and the same. So that kind of logic follows that if we are trying to say that the aggregates are the self, then those sorts of faults incur. We can't talk about the sort of aggregates acting in any way, or the self acting with respect to the aggregates, because they are one and the same. And then if we have this if we are going to assert that the self is the aggregates, then say, for example, the form aggregate that we have doesn't continue beyond just this life. It's newly established in this life from the mother's egg and the father's sperm. And so there's no continuity of form through lives. And so if we have asserted that the self is the aggregate, then we fall into these issues of all of the kind of actions that we did with that form in a previous life, those kinds of karmas that we committed. Well, because there's no continuity of that form, those karmas would become wasted. They wouldn't ripen onto a form in the future, because that's a different self that's essentially different from the earlier form that it created those karmas. So it would have the issue that we wouldn't experience the results of the karma. And then it would also have the, so karma would be wasted. We wouldn't have to encounter the results of the karma that we had created in the past in a different form. Because again, if we're identifying the self as being essentially the aggregates, and we had a totally different form aggregate in a previous life, then we're going to have this issue that those karmas are wasted. They're not actually going to ripen on that future self, if it's a different sort of a self based on a different kind of form. And so too, when we have this form that has been established newly in this life, well, we experience various sufferings on the basis of this form. Well, where did those come from? It would have to be the case that we are encountering karmas that we did not create. So these two faults are related to either creating karma that one doesn't experience the results of, or meeting proceeding with the results of karma that one had not created. And then there's the issue of being able to recall previous lives. If we have like the Buddha talking about, well, in such and such a life, I was this person, that wouldn't be a viable or logical thing to say. It's not tenable to assert that, given that there's no continuity between the form and therefore the self of this life and those of previous lives. So again, this is something that is not extremely hidden. It is something that these are points that we are able to know from really leading back to our own experience, our own direct experience of things. And so we shouldn't sort of think that these are concepts that are beyond our comprehension or that we can't understand them, but actually we can develop an understanding through utilizing logic. So here then we turn to the kind of issues that would incur if we had a self that were essentially different from the aggregates. So if it were the case that the self is totally separate, different from the aggregates, then the self wouldn't have the characteristics of the aggregates. So if we were to say like, when your your form is sick, to say, oh, I am sick, you wouldn't be able to do that because there's no essential connection between the aggregates, say what the mind thinks or what the body does, and that self, because we're asserting that they're essentially totally different. And so here, this is something that is really, there are different sort of things that are being refuted here in terms of refuting some kind of self that is totally separate apart from the aggregates. We can see that there's no way to actually assert such a self because we can't have any sort of appearance of the self except on the basis of those aggregates, whether it's a form aggregate or feeling or mental consciousness. There's some basis for the arising of a sense of self. And so if there's nothing outside of the aggregates that we can identify as the self that causes that sort of appearance of the self to arise. Like when you have two distinct things, if you have blue and you have yellow, when blue arises, you don't have to have any sort of connection with yellow. Or when you have like your two hands, whatever the left hand is doing, the right hand doesn't necessarily need to be doing. They're actually totally independent. And if that is the case with the self and the aggregates, then there are multiple sort of faults that would incur. And really one of the most important points here is that the self has to be designated on the basis of the aggregates. There's no other place to put that. We can't assert that there is some self entirely separate and apart from the aggregates.
Oh yeah, that is it. Oh, that is it. That and that kokasura. That competition, so we competitive drosona. That drug to cigar. So we competitive drosona. That draw at Tagua. Oh, that drug to Sipa, Tanya Beshibe Tagwadawa. There's some get down draw at Sagura. Talk with Tasam Stirwa. That drug to Sipa talk with Tagura. Talk about this some because you don't draw and draw down, drew your down draw at the Tagasha. Talk and listen to those. Company Damare, Sobun Tamare, the main game druggies or was in the China Rayomara. Or Tiodico, Rawe time draw pochi or Maresicora. Rawe time draw pochiana. That's so good I chief to your da Kagashini or is chief that had any idea how good. So Bukoran Tade or the vicinity to Mudua. So would I bear around with Tades and your vicinity to Mudua, so good get him the dross on the town draw a chateau Marwa. Lagwa Yen, she never could have chateau Mardo. Sako chief do me Tade do Mabate round with the Mabata. Sebo Hako do Tanganzo, the Sena. Oh, Tati was in Jatsona. And the Shinship but talk was Sashinalia. Tell a Tanga Shegura. The Shinship but talk was in a Tanga Shegura. Tina woman to wake up to Tatungi Chelas in the Shegura. Or Titanita Lela Shade. Or the Shinship but talk was not a Carson with Osana. Pumise. Pumbunga de Damares, or Chigmares Gura. Pumbulation means Pumbulate, Shabet, Shinship but your Mares, Sanjay, your Mares Gura. Pumi, Pumbulation means. Tinita Davichi that had any shares on the Yabusha Sarangazo. Pumi Pumbulation means. I got it, talk about the Karium Dosana. Della Pumise, Pumi Pumbulation. Ella Pumi is a teaching ship by the dance of the chair. Pumbu de Tunisian Betsugi attend your Maresora. Teaching Penangazo Taba the chair, pellet chair. Take on the any shindo Shana. Taba de Tenny shindo Tunisian Betsugi, thank you, ora. O Tende Maresora. Pumbi Pumbulation, Tella Pumi is a teaching ship by the dance of the chair. Shirubine Nalo Tachi Sora, dance a chain, Pumbu de Sobo Chilo, Yuvesora. O Tendation your Maresora. Dishinship by tension, Pumbu de Tilla temperature, tension between Sora, Kagajane. Josegalia, the power temperature. Della Pumise. There temes Pumbula, Dishinship by tension to the temper your mother, 10 temperatures. Dishinship by Pumbu tension upon the temper your mother. Pumbula dishinship by tension between 2 temper your mother, Sora. Tension between temper mother, Sora. The Tade in Rudo, the Tagin Tade, your mother said, Rawe Tade to your mother said, Tina do Rudo, Tadera. Pumi Pumbulation, Metella Pumiteme. Tishinship by Punde measure. Tishinship by the Pumbula, Demba to your mother, Demba. Demba de la Nere, no chip and Demba to your mother, no Tade Demba to your mother, Signa Tade Nietzsche, Tella. Tisha Pundema, Canderesna. Legilia Sudan, Pachudan, Legilia Pachuna, Legilia Pachudan, Debaresena, Kaga de Juderwa, Coloyeva Sangura, Tadeg de Juderwa. Taya Legin Sobudan Dendosana, Legin Sobuda Zeta Marwachida, Mochibin de Juderwa. Oh, Tisigora. Mochibet Sugi Rame Tadi, Pumbulan Dembesigi Yomare. Montade Besugi, Ravetati and Debesigi or Mares. Dembatiliata, Mochi da Tade Nichegudwa, Shandanite Taderedwa. And the Tanga Reswa, Pumi, Pumbulation, Della Pumi, Tedeme, Tishiba Pundemis, Tanga Chavachera. Oh, teach in the Rawe, Tishiba Yomaris, that Tishiba, in and assembly in and the code, Netu Tadula Chibarwa. Sanjay in and the Hezin and the Sujin and the Yagachin and the Duachin and the Koyoda, you look teach about it or do. Netu Tadula, or teach Shegdo, not the Sheda.
So here, when we say, if our form aggregate, if we are walking along and we say, I'm going, I'm walking, that is conventionally acceptable when we sort of leave it at that level existence of merely being posited by mind, by saying that, well, I'm going, and that's the sort of level that we leave it at, that is totally conventionally acceptable. We can accept that we are going as our form aggregate is going. But when we look for and search for, well, where is the goer, or where is the self within that form aggregate? If we look for some kind of autonomously existing I, is there something that we can point to within that form aggregate? It's not the form as a whole. It's not just like the feet or something. It's not the motion of that. When we begin to look for it, we can't actually find something that we can point to as that the referent of our positing a self. When we leave it at the level of, oh, that's merely posited by mind, it exists in that way. But when we look for the thing itself within that basis of designation, we can't find something to point to that says, well, that is it. But we also can't say that there is no connection whatsoever. If the self is totally separate from the aggregates, then it wouldn't be logical in a worldly sense to say, I'm going, because there's no connection between that I or that self and the kind of the aggregates that are actually in motion. So this is something, again, that we are able to know through our own kind of logic and investigation. If we investigate and analyze, we can come to an understanding of this. And this is presented, the sort of logic that we go through is presented in two different verses. First, in a verse by Nagarjuna in his 22nd chapter of the fundamental verses on wisdom, an examination of the Tathagata, where he says, he is not the aggregates, nor other than the aggregates. No aggregates are there in him, and in the aggregates he is not found. The Tathagata is not the owner of the aggregates. What then is the Tathagata? And so then we'll also follow up with a verse from the Madhyamaka Avatara, Chandra Kirti's work, where he describes sort of 7 different relationships. But here in this verse by Nagarjuna, we have these 5 different kinds of sort of relationships between the self and the aggregates. Here, the sort of Tathagata and the aggregates. So the first 2 express the 2 that we have already gone through, this sort of relationship between being inherently or essentially the same. So he is not the aggregates. The Tathagata, we can't say is the aggregates, nor is he other than the aggregates. Is the Tathagata something that is essentially different from those aggregates? And then we get into the 2 different sort of levels of understanding of inherently being the support and the supported. So we don't have a relationship. It says here, no aggregates are there in him. So if we take like, or the next line, and in the aggregates, he is not found. Here, these 2 are examining the sort of relationship of supported and support and supported. So we can't say that the sort of aggregates are essentially the support and the Tathagata is the supported or the thing that is based upon that inherently or essentially, nor is it the case that the Tathagata is inherently the support that is supporting the aggregates or that is holding up the aggregates. So those 2 levels of relationship are also not acceptable. And then we get to the 5th of these, which is the Tathagata is not the owner of the aggregates. So here, this is expressing like, again, a relationship of sort of inherence or kind of possession. And here we could have 2 levels of possession. There is possession or inherence where you're talking about things that are essentially different. Like say Devadatta owns some cows. He's possessing or holding on to something that is essentially different from him. Whereas if you are to say Devadatta has form, well, that's expressing something that is essentially the same. So you can have those 2 kind of relationships of ownership. So here, none of these alternatives are acceptable. It's not acceptable for them to be essentially the same, essentially different, to have a relationship of inherently supported and supported either way, or this kind of relationship of inherence. And so in their ultimate nature, there's nothing that we can point to that can be found when we talk about, and this is not just the Tathagata, about talking about the self or things, notions of good and bad and all of these things, etc. When one searches and tries to find that thing, there's nothing that can be pointed to. This is the kind of ultimate reality of phenomena.
Oh yeah. What do you mean? That is Tanga de social channel some tanguro namge. Oh social round some ta. And if social de namjungara de samluna samlu cordan chena. Pumbu la tenepa and de some tanya belu tapa some ngaji year some medwa. Get some madome some roching medwa. Tapa some maimba round year some gudwa. Oh, tita be round at Tadio Mare some gura. Karesin Pumbuda, Rawa Tadi, Pumbu Gata Chiksheneo Mare. Pumbungata Rawa Tadesheneo Mare, Sroa. And a Pumbulia, Rawa Tadi Pateneo Mare, Rawa Tadilla, Pumbutsu Teneo Mares. The Pumbula Rawa Tan Dembesugio Mares. Dembesug. Shinanale, Tada, see you and she tended Dembesug, or Tadeshin Dembayo Mare. Legend of Palanta Dembesig, Motor than Dembesig, or Tadeshin Demba Yomare. No more Chibachene, Rawe Tartin Dembesig Yomares. No, then there's also some time ending, some Namji Social Langina, some Humbuda, Sobuda, some the Soasola. Then it Taba Maiba, Taba Maiba, Tetan Drum and get social round what you use, somebody may do something. Neta Mebalia. Number shaku yorno. Chebasheti, how don't be Chebashitanterwa. Any time somebody and Jogum says Shinepa, Jogati Chegu yorno. Oh, social Talichan, and that is sensible as Charanesi, social chan some Tankura. Oh, Tichila, yeah.
So normally we analyze in relation to ourselves. So here, like this verse that is analyzing the Tathagata, we should sort of be thinking about it in relation to our own sense of an I and sense of a self. So normally we have an idea of there being some kind of like an autonomous self that exists in its own right, that isn't just merely designated on the basis of that of our aggregates. And if it is the case that we had such a self that existed in that way that it appears to us, then it would have to exist in one of these various ways. It would have to be the same with our aggregates, essentially the same as those aggregates, or essentially different from the aggregates, or essentially supported by the aggregates, or essentially the support of the aggregates, or have this relationship of inherence, of like possessing the aggregates. And when we examine in any of these ways, there can't be such a self. There's not like say this in terms of the relationship of inherence. It's not like say the way that there are lions and tigers in the forest, or like Devadatta possesses some cows. We can't speak about these two essentially different things having that kind of ownership or possession, or nor in the sort of inherence in terms of possessing something that is essentially the same. So here, this I that it appears to us in terms of our innate mind, we have the strong sense of there being some kind of autonomous or self that exists in its own right. When we examine and try to analyze and find it, we can't substantiate its existence in any of these 5 ways. And so this is the kind of way in which we go through the meditation on insight. And once we have come to some kind of an understanding, we then can do placement meditation, where we are placing the mind in the kind of certainty that we have found. And this is the way that we gradually improve our kind of understanding of selflessness.
Oh yeah. That is under needy. Tangal resong, Jebachin Mebshason. Loving Dawatabo Umajubakos ni number Tange Galia, Tani, Yang Yani, Lagba, Lagba Nengi Wara, and a Tatin said Shagiwara. O decoration, Umajubakos, Shingdale Peshan Sorba, Shingda. Tangema in Shingdale Peshare, Koloda Chicha, that is sign Namdruta, and a Karsure. Computer Tesula Peshana, Abudua, Chala Mambushiora, Nalo Chala Mambushiora, Teletene, Lega Mambushiora, or Tesonza, Tinesis and Water. Allo Dautraba Carson, Shinda Ranela, Shendu means Shemi Main, teaching that had they needed to do. Shinda de Rangayala, Chichene Homare, Ranga Tadesene Homarese, Shinda Singeti, Rangayala, Tushin, Jelny Shower Mato. Shinda de Rangayana, Koloda, Segada, O Tesuletene, Chigdo Yomare, Tadeto Yomare Sura. Shinda Raela, Shandime, Shemima, Shemai by the Chigamai. Then young machines, Shinda Raela, Shandime, Shemima, then young machines. Shinda Raela, Shemima, then Dambatera, Kitagin Dosara, Teddy Chibatira. Shinda Raela, Shandime, Shemu, Tendemas. Yana Lami, Yana Tandir means Tagina Shichiwara. Yana Lia, Shinda Yana, Shinda Tension to Tembetu Omares. Yana to the Pa, Shinda Tension Betu Tembetu Omares. Yana Lami, Yana Tandir means. Duba some means, Takba Naya the Ni did it. Duba, Shinda Yana, Duba Sowati. Shinda Mare Sungara. Garrison, Shinda Yana, Sowala Tanish in the Tagiwara. Could Dakshire, Dakshe Maris, Dakshi Dakshu Sejora. Shinde Yala Chokbala Assembly China, or Tadi Shinda Res Patagua. Chokba de Dakshire, Chokbala Tenish in the Patagora. Dakshita Takbe Shing the Kagayokora. Chokba de Shinde Yala Chokba Samde, Shinda Maris Wara. Oh, Tikaras and Chokbala Tenish in the Tagores. Kambuta to Namtu to the Nechala Mamushi or Alexander. Tezukanga Tene, Chokbala Tene, and then Namdu Chavaja Namle Pirma, Babsu Kanga Chavaja Shawara, Mato Tezula Madun Shayomato. Oh, Shindarana, Shandu Shemi and them. Yala me, Yana Tadame, Duba Sami, Yip did it. Duba na Yip needed Nason Haba number. Then do that, Tatu Shadore. Shinde Ibdi, Shinda Mare, Shara. Shinde Yana Tsobade, Shinda Mare. Sheza, Ta Shinda Singade, Shinde Yana, La Tenepa, Tagbazam the Shagurmado, Tagbazam Membe Shinda Shiyana, and the Tajun to Sevesi, Shindani, Yokorio Mare Sungora, or Tina Shin Namduta, Kambuta, the Legacy, and getting a Chalatonda Mabujira. Oh, Tezu Mare de Omare. Tezule shendu lega shingi se yo mare tezule tene pa ta ju sha go no chilo yi pak ba de ko re mare o yala re ne shen re ma to yala choba le tene lega shingi de le tene ta go ra o de ta tin de te ra de chilam na o de tene se ta lu chu cha ne ta ge so bu de ya ta mare se ro ne phung phung choba de ya ta mare se tin de pa sha ne ta tin re do do Oh, tende samutane ta tonda rawe ta shiyana kawa yene yesa de se samuta de samuta ta mindu samjani jogum se tongban se de komgu yodo ta me ba se oh ya tijilana.
So then Chandra Kirti in his entry to the middle way adds two more sort of levels of analysis. So we have this sort of 5-pointed analysis from Nagarjuna, where he's explaining that the self and the aggregate has those 5 sort of extremes in terms of the way that the relationship could exist. And Chandra Kirti expands this, adds 2 to make it a 7-fold kind of analysis. And he uses as an example a chariot, although we could maybe modernize that and use like a plane or a computer or think about some sort of modern equipment. We have all kinds of things that we could use as a basis for investigating. And so if we say that there is a sort of thing, like say a plane or whatever it is, that is really truly existent, that is existent in its own right, we would have to be able to posit it as existing in one of these 7 ways. Now, again, we can posit something like a chariot as existing independence upon the basis of designation, like on the basis of its parts. We designate something called a chariot, but we can't say that it actually is its parts, that it, again, we have something that is designated, and the thing designated is not the same as the basis of designation. So here, to read the verse from Chandra Kirti, he says, like a chariot, it is not thought to be different from its parts, not non-different, not possessing them, not within its parts, not containing its parts, not the mere collection or the shape of them. So here, when it comes to investigating, and again, we're using the basis of something like a chariot or a plane or whatever it may be, that's designated on the basis of all of these various parts, all of this metal and screws and bolts and all of that kind of stuff. We can't say that it exists as its parts, but it's not actually something that we could identify as being separate from its parts, nor does it have a kind of a relationship of inherence in terms of possessing it, nor is there this relationship of support or supported, as we saw in the earlier verse from Nagarjuna. Now, the 2 that are added, we say it is not the mere collection. So again, we're using this example of like a chariot or something, but really examining the self and the aggregates. So we can't say that the self is just the mere collection of those things, although that mere collection, say in the case of a chariot or a plane or whatever, is the various parts. We can identify those parts as being the basis of designation. The thing which is designated, the chariot, the self, whatever it may be, is not the same as that basis of designation. So here there's although we could assert that the mere collection is the basis of designation, that mere collection of those parts and so forth is not actually the thing designated. And nor is it the case that it's a sort of the shape or the arrangement of those parts that one can say is the thing designated. Again, although we designate, like say a chariot, that is something that is posited on the basis of designation, a set of particular parts, we can't say that it is its individual parts, nor is it aside from its individual parts, nor does it inherently possess those parts, nor is it inherently supported by those parts, nor is it inherently the support of those parts. It isn't the mere collection of those parts or the shape of them. And so this is the way in which we engage. And here, observing the self of the person, we investigate how could it exist in any of these 7 ways. And when we engage in this analysis and come to find that, well, it can't, if we had such an autonomous, really truly existent self, it would have to exist in one of these 7 ways. And when we come to find that it can't actually exist in that way, then we come to place our minds in that sort of understanding of selflessness that we have arrived at.
Oh yeah, that's one. Oh, that in the dollar in the song. That's our duty seems. Rather, Samete, duty sem necessary song. Now, because that's our duty sem. Kenny Tower do at this, Narazukanga, Gangas, Rawan Shibuji and Ashar. Any Tigaliani, I is the Chokanga Tigrido. Some I some Geshe Yeshe Thabkhe. Any Chagenda, Tesulia, never can get on that. Get a meeting by Chona Trazi. They might get to Zulia and to say Chagdang some to or no. Diana and Shendoshi, Takshan and Zinda Dasha and Asa Rawasha. And then I sing it. And then I Namisara, I Lumbasa, I Chilus, and I Mirixera, I thought of 60. And the Pajodelia teach on meeting by 60. Diana and Shendoshi, Takshan Shale, and those a chorus city. Shentro se Kabdicha Sarasi Tigdoa. Diana and Shendoshi, Takshan Shale. The data on the young delaying about time to join, and it can't get to your girl, Teletene. Chatan, Yiri, Chatan, Chiga, the leg, and Basar Kanga, Ram, Miki, Sham, Miki, Kanga, Yogora. Or till the Taji, our duty seems. Do you think getting as made the chisel never can get you to Sigora? Or till the Taji, our duty some 20,000 to artists. Do she Pumbu did on days? Do she the Pumbu day? Gelatin and Duce of Pombo Delia, Rawe Daji Yomarata, Tongba de Songora. The Chipombo did on the Dela Simja Yomaese. The Chipom Dela Simjese, Rawa Tashi Omare Songora. Dela Simja Yomai. Pechane Hutsune, Tantare. Chidariana saw Namlatene Shedesha, that the Shimpombo Namtene could you Simja Shechu to say. Oh, Tisongduati, Duco. Pumbula tene tabasa madonga surround Chimay Sangura. Oh, Tini, Nanji Sukchambuana, and it to the semblance. Until it turning on Jahakudua. Mimbumda Mabuse Kuna say some good. That you never can get two Soricera, Miti, and to city. Shinan Sabration that you something or doing on it, or as a milliora, Simjam Bumda Mabuse Kuna Segra. Zambul Kora Mavasoko some social door. Oh, Tidico. So Janka Jointeres, Chagdan Kaga Jointeres. I saw social lumber, social media. Today Chagdan Shukshimbo. Oh, number China, Judah. King Italia and Doswa. Ranke Chambure, Rangi Namike Chambure, Rangi Chiso Kachambure, Steve Kachamburina, the Gresera. Kiran the Kachambuch and Shandal never much Sara. The Tambudera. This any Judah. So catching but so like a chagura. They shall never much and did it what it on Buddha. Shall it so much as pant on a pant or pen matona. Never much is Sarah, and it is why and it's why young dog rigdo. Or that it trust us, standing or teach each other.
Oh. So this kind of thought of I, it's actually said in the sutra by the Buddha that what is called self, like this thought I, is Mara's thought, is like a demon's view, and this would be your view. So when we have this idea of a self, when we are holding to an I, and we hold really strongly to that sense of I, we're then going to have a kind of attachment to our side and aversion toward the other, toward that we see as harmful to us in some way. And so it is on the basis of this grasping at an I and making a distinction between self and other, that from that, all of our various faults arise, all of our various afflictions that compel us to engage in karma and so forth. And so as long as we have this kind of idea of an I that exists like autonomously in its own right, we are going to then perpetuate our existence within samsara. But there is no such I as it appears to us, as though it had some kind of existence in its own right or autonomous kind of existence, but it's something that is merely designated on a basis of designation. But we don't normally hold it in that way. We hold it to be like really, truly existent. And so, as it says, as this sutra continues, what is called self is Mara's thought. And this would be your view. The formation of aggregates is empty. In this, there is no sentient being. So it is like this thought is being compared to like a demon. This is a little bit sort of out of the way of this, but when we have this kind of thought of I and grasping at ourselves as more important and our like family, our community, our country as more important than others, then this is what leads us to have the thought to say, kill hundreds of thousands of people, to harm others in such drastic ways. It all really draws back to that fundamental kind of thought. And so fundamentally holding ourselves as important and sort of our community, our family, our country as important is not necessarily destructive, so long as we are not harming others. So long as, even if we say aren't able to benefit them, as long as we are able to refrain from harming, that is something that is good. But most of the time, when we have this thought of I and hold that I, that self, to be more important than others, we do engage in activities that are harmful like that create negative karma, and we end up creating harm and so forth. But so going back to this quotation from the sutra, it then connects this with the example of a chariot. So just as one speaks of a chariot in dependence upon a collection of parts, we speak conventionally of a sentient being upon the aggregates. So conventionally speaking, there is something that we can talk about it as being a sentient being, but there is no such self or I as it appears to us. And as much as we are able to, we should try to avoid causing harm from that kind of idea, and as much as we are able to benefit others as well.
Oh yeah, that oh induction called Dadi, Yabuchi Samrutan, Da Meba de Yabu Samrutan, and it Yabuchi Kochas, and Shanda Kangar Pachas on Roa. She did get dog and Dushin, Sheba Dishin, Kunla Lusha Sudwa. She did get dog and Dushin is Dadi, Tatin, so what's there. Chip to Jeta, Tangata, Tatula Sobase, Nita Rawa Nambu Social Lange Nalia, Rawa, Tayuba, somebody never shares Sona Sogora. She died to get dog and Dushini, Sheba Dishin, Kula Lus Charges, or Tinashi, and it's also loose Yarva, Yala Changi Lus Yorva, so Tonga, Tada, Dezukanga, Miga, Nawacho, and then Luted, Yala Changi Luchita, Yala Lagwakang said of Yora. Lute Chigbari, Yakashi, Adi, Rawa Mamado, Agadashi Luta, Semda to Rawa Yorsa, Yomato, Lute Chigbari, Tana Shichabachana, Sashangi Lute, the Rangadashi, Lagwakang Bangola Soba, Teso da Chida Tadela Sobatagani Chigbara. Nobukangal Chigbarata, Tali in Andra, Yido in Andra, Yidomeo in Andra, Kangal Pachane, Chabachane, Tichana. Rangwine Yobate, Rangwine, Yudomewa, Trada, Yobate, Tomba Sandubiaton. In the Chidarki, Dag and Dushini, Sheba, Tishin, Kuna, Lusha, attention to any Shandal Chan, Shembache, with some good or teacher Lamna.
So here, this it continues by saying that so as we come to understand that the self it doesn't actually exist in any of these kinds of 7 ways or any of the ways that it appears to us to exist, then we should investigate, we should sort of take and apply the mind to other phenomena. So here when it comes to the self, we can say that it is designated on the basis of the aggregates, but we can't actually find the self within the aggregates or find something that we can point to as being that thing. And so too, we should apply this to all other kinds of phenomena, expand this out and place the mind in an understanding that nothing else beyond the sort of self has that kind of existence either. So we might look at, say, the basis of designation and think, well, okay, the self is something that is merely designated on that basis, but that basis is truly existent. Well, then one investigates and analyzes and comes to see that that too doesn't have the kind of autonomous real existence that it appears to have. Even the basis of designation is like the mind like the self lacking in any kind of autonomous or sort of existence from its own side.
Oh, yeah, Miss. I thought that was a ditchilam. I feel true. Oh, dear Kasura. Kansa Dame, the Church Dame, and you shake doa. Oh, dear Tanda. Kansa Dame, said the Kansa. Tanta Batruba, Rawa, Tanya to Matruba, Temper Matruba de la Kansa Dame. Pumbuda come the Geshe over Church. Tandambar Matruba, Rawa to Matruba, the Church Dame, Shera. Teacher. Thank you, Lolia. Chur Tamje, don't sit dame says the wa. Chur Tamje dame says the wa. O dear, dear Castle, Chur Tamje da said the Dada Kansa, the Kibuta said, take a young could you mother. Dangi look over that, Dangi. Pubayina Koran Dangi Shiore, Soboyina Ranga Dangi Shiorwa, or take the Ramabe, Dangi do Truba Mevatelia, Chur Tamje dame basera. Kasta live bagaza. Tela taji chawane, Shala Ramalebe Moran Shites, Temebane Tameba Ose. Then Sheda Kansaki Yeve, Yison de Kansaki Dameba, the Shagi Dameba Osodwa, Chesa Kansaki Dame, Shagi Dame set that, Chetamje Dame set out the Karesna. Round Dangi to Drube, Rome, Tame, Trime, Rome, Richam, Telechagoda. Chetamje Dameba said the Tade. Tangi Rawa do Drube, Tangi Mabade, Suta to Richard Kari in a teacher. And Chigi Dame da Kansa Dame Shasona, Chigi Dame to Kansa Maige, Pumbu come the Kijila Sobo, Tandam Madusha. Kansa Dame to Kansa, Kansa, Kibus and Gete, Tandam Madu Kogoda. Or teach you Lomna.
So when we talk about selflessness, there's the selflessness of the person and the selflessness of phenomena. And so establishing that the person doesn't truly really exist, doesn't have sort of inherent existence, isn't ultimately existent, that is the selflessness of the person. And the selflessness of phenomena entails looking at phenomena besides the person and recognizing that they are not ultimately existent, not truly existent, not established in their own right. And so for Prasangikas in particular, all phenomena are identified as being selfless. When we talk about a self, we might want to think of like a person, but really this is something that applies to both a person and all other phenomena. So as we had quoted last time, where it said that all of this is without its own power, therefore there is no self. So when it comes to either phenomena other than the person, things like external phenomena, sounds and sights and tastes and touch and so forth, and all those kinds of phenomena that are included within the 18 constituents other than the person, or whether we are talking about the person, their lack of that kind of autonomy, of having their own sort of existence in their own right, or true existence, this is what is being discussed in relation to both phenomena and the person. And so that selflessness equally applies to both.
Oh, yeah, that's that Dit Nanzu Semling Ekura Hashangi Tenika Sure, Namo Pawata, Tendeshe to Karakoresana, Chia Hila Mesiba and Degrees. Takje Chigde Siji Sambutana, Yamu Pero de Tawa Koarasona, Chia Hila Mesiba de Commission, Tekom Gurmato, and then Sheba Chin some Tendeshe or Marese, from Guardo, Chia Hila Mesiba Comgurmado. Senda meba da tende kongba ta tili atanda ta tende laudon kundi ta meba to laudon kundi shirabji konggo restambo to di shirabji singire mado semcheji do shagwa da yele mesiba tende sheyo mardo shirabji cheba che ko rese tanda nga ju chik do de da ta nga ta tende cheba chera o cheba le tene ne rawe ta de medusam rawe da meba komna ne rawe ta yoba le tene Chandra Kirti ko nyor dogrba judi pakana jebu nyor rerwa oti indisa tini yele mecheba sam gudege mare shirab ji cheba che une tane ne chudi karina logdo dengara ju chinji loga samlo karina tishen bache tin jimba nanshi member de hako ache ne ti shengur sungdwa samanam de kap sungdwa di sunjo mebane tebon wane new mayinse di sunjun meba nese lokto degi yudi pa sunjun meba mashina ko meba soto marwa ko yile mashiba sam dena nega yile mashira mato yang ko le hongurto o chen di sunjun meba ne tebo wan ne mas ane dile shija bale yula tame ton ne sebe sabun gabar yo sungudwa yula ta meba de ten cheba chen ta meba da ha kosona ta yoban jimbe ne koye chawa de pa ne ga ne meba de do ese Yele Mesheba something memory Mare Sungudwa, or Titon Dalia Tanda Sebastia, that is Mambusungutwa, teaching love, when so. Yeah.
So here, with regards to these points, this is really, we should remember in relation to the kind of view of Ha Shang, who was asserting that in order to get rid of our various afflictions, we don't want to engage with an antidote because that's just going to sort of proliferate our conceptual thinking. Instead, he advocated that in order to remove all of our sort of wrong conceptions, we just need to place the mind in nothingness. We need to think about nothing whatsoever, and that in his mind would act as an antidote. And so here, all of this is being taught in order to rebuff that kind of wrong view, because this is something that needs to be known by wisdom. It is by cultivating wisdom that we are able to counteract the kind of ignorance that acts as the fundamental cause of samsara. So this is why we engage in this investigation of using our own wisdom, whether we are looking into whether the self and the aggregates could be one and multiple, that kind of reasoning, or looking into this five-fold analysis or the seven-fold analysis. All of these are in order to be able to extricate that cause of our suffering within samsara. We have to get at that grasping at a self by actually cultivating the antidote to it, the proper sort of knowledge. So we need to know what is actually sort of wrong with the way that we are perceiving things in order to be able to extricate that wrong view. So here, there's a quotation from Chandra Kirti's Pramanavartaka where he talks about this, that we need to actually sort of understand the way in which our grasping is wrong in order to uproot that. And it's only by doing so that we are able to remove the result. So again, it's by stopping the cause of something that we can stop the result. So much as we are able to come to an understanding of selflessness, so much are we able to avert that kind of grasping at a self. And slowly over time, we can eventually get rid of the root of samsara. So Aryadeva too has said in the 400 verses that it is by realizing selflessness, by seeing selflessness, that we can stop the root of samsara. It doesn't happen otherwise.
Oh yeah. I'm going to do Sabah Keshe, change them the Inda. Oh, Dele Swa. Then Dinyamdo, come some Budini, Semzamo, Nyamdo, Semshin, etc. I didn't make a shaker. Jumashindo, not also now as assembly, you, Dramida, then bad Meba Shindo, Temper Yoba, Nagreton, not so Shindo. Jumashindo, not also, Jumakangi, Division Talala Soba Treaties and Talang Omena, Talang Yimba Nangje, Kashe Dili Talang Oneres and Shimba Yungordo. What in a sense, Chotamje Rawando Tubam, Rangshinji Tuba, Rangune Tuba, Meshindo, Terenawa to Kanga Kumata Bresgora. Kumashindo Nazo now, same day, any day, Tembakagi or the Makaya. Same Tembatuba, you Nazo Nangang, same day, and Tembayo Mares. Chirugi yu de ko yo mares chiru yu kaya de to je ti temba truba kaya to da sungo ro tambu chiru ka ban je ba yese tambu chilo yu de tende yo mares anje ne na ga sem dia temba yu ba ka yo ro ngo de ne man de ten do ra ta de ti ten de nyam do se kam sum bo de ne sem zam mo nyam do sem shin se te da re che tak ba tha da ne sem kona yin ba to ne te la so so ta na Chetamje Ngonyela Soso Takba Ino, She Sembia Ngonyela Soso Toko, Chetamje, Kamsumbudini, Semgi Danizam Re Songora. The Dari Che Takba Tadanes, Che Soja Terrorichala Soba, Che Takba de Sama, Sem Konanos, Semgi Danizam, Raran Zimbe Sora, Raran Zimbe Chema, Semgi Danizam Yemba, Tone Ese. Tela Soso Tana, Chetamje Ngonya Soso. Takba yino so tezo takje cheje chwe tamje rangi ngo ni sam dan tambar rangi ngo yeme takba chigyo re sungora yino se sembye ngo ni sosor togo se sembye ngo de dan tambar chuma dula soba sosor togo ten de dar chwe do se dan tambar na sembyan tambar merong de se dan tambar rangi ne chwe chwe sembya Same day, I don't know about Mare. Chirugi, you don't know about Mare. Same day, don't know about Mare. Don't know about Sam Jantamber Mironde. Tange Chumbengo only Sula Soba number Zimbe, Semya Nazo, the number now at the SS. Or the same day Chumbengo or used to buy in by Shindo Sam day, the Tonga Shiba there. Chumbengo now nation ko dada tempere de mardo chumbengo kangi shi chumbengo ni sula soba number zimbe semni na soba number now at ss semble you na so now at ss go do ne na to now at ss ne kare Temba nido kala yuruse, o tezo ko nawa nashi temba marese. O tiba do chilamna, mambucha mer.
So here, as for picking up from the text, in the text where we had left off last time, now there's a paragraph missing in the English version. So I'll just go back through what we might have missed. It says, so last time we had begun by examining these sort of external phenomena and examining that they can't have some sort of real, true existence. And so here, beginning in the text, it says, therefore, due to grasping tightly and incorrectly at such things as form and so forth over beginningless time, the mind itself appears to ordinary people as form and so forth, separate and external, just like the appearance of form and so forth that are perceived in a dream. In that in the ultimate sense, form and so forth do not exist separate from being an aspect of mind, should be analyzed. So one begins by examining external phenomena. And then one turns to, but one who has the thought that the realms are just mind, having understood that everything is that is designated as phenomena is only mind, comes to think, when this mind is analyzed specifically, that it is an analysis of the nature of all phenomena. Thus, he would specifically analyze the nature of mind. Such a person analyzes in this way. So here, one begins by examining how it is that external phenomena can't exist sort of ultimately, really, truly. And then one begins to turn toward the mind. So first, examining that that all of the three realms are just in the nature of mind, one comes to the conclusion that such external phenomena can't exist in the way that they appear to. And then one begins to examine the ultimate nature of mind. So in the ultimate sense, this is continuing back where we have in the text, the mind too cannot be real. So how could the mind that apprehends only the false nature or physical form and so forth, and appears in various aspects, be real? Just as physical forms and so forth, which are false, it too is false. So one begins by examining these kinds of external phenomenon, looking at, well, they appear as if they had some sort of real, true existence, but they actually are false in that they don't exist in the way that they appear. We can have this kind of like illusion of, say, horses and elephants and so forth, and they appear to us as like real horses and elephants, but they don't actually exist in that way. They are false kind of objects. And so too, when we examine the kind of external physical forms, we see that these things are false, that they appear in various aspects, but they are actually in the nature sort of not existing in the way that they appear. And so too, with the mind that is perceiving them, since that mind does not exist separately from physical forms and so forth, which are false, it too is false. Just as physical forms and so forth possess various aspects and their identities are neither one nor many. Similarly, since the mind is not different from them, its identity too is neither one nor many. So here we have these kinds of various appearances that come to mind, and one can see that those appearances don't exist as they appear. And so too, one should turn the examination to that mind to which they appear, recognizing that that mind too doesn't actually exist as it appears.
Oh yeah. 다 지들 속라 속바 준바 대신도 속도 유 속라 속바 준바 대신도 아니 셈자 데레 챈도 템바트바 텐데 요 마르 준바 이바 치바레 송송 어 티처바 단데네마 가르셰 그러잖아 셈자나 매니 베니 셈 주마 좀도 미미 바템 바스도 셈데 자나 니요 마르스 테 셈데 주마다 부레스 티체도 셈자나 미니 베 kumatabur mimi barten basu dontambar mimi tamba chidar sola sokba na soje namba yimbe chigda dume ngo ni mayimba de shendu sola sokba chashe na sola sokba tende da na so na wate sangma tamje de rangi yanla da ani chigda tadele sokba rawa chuji dontambar tube chuji cheba chena ragma ton ta da chigwa chidar sokla sokba na so namba yimba chida tume ngo yima yimba deshin dosa semjan tele kuna mebe chere chida tume ngo ni mayin ose don tamba tube chigdo tugumare rangi dakshida don tamba tube tade duya tugumare se chigbare songyo don tume ngo ni mayin ose teda wena semne kumala sokbe ngo ni tabu kona ose semde kumata ure kumagi talantu sa ngaje ki mi malebe tamwa to sola tada langbungu ne yoba nange yore shenge yordo kumake te ya talanangi yorde ngone meba kora ha ko yore kumake talanangi tu de talan me asam kora ha ko yordo shenda to se ne ko talangone re sammi tu ne talando nawa de shamba ni ga yordo tinde 대다와나 셈네 주말로 속에 ngo니 코나고세 셈 지다와 대신도 최 탐제냐 주말로 속에 ngo니 따부 코나고세 셈다 총바 최 탐제냐 주마다 부레 돈담바 주바 나시 나와다르 두구마도 야 돈담바 메신도 마트부신도 돈담바 주바 나기요도 주마데 달랑로 속에 ngo 메바신도 메신도 달랑고 나기요라 어디나시레 송거라 셈 제다와 대신도 최 탐제에 주말로 소병 오니 따부 코나오 she chedo so what the cheba chene and this she should nagi shebala soba sama Juma da bu sheba chebude so ra tiba do chilam na
So here, when one then is doing this kind of examination in the way that when we are trying to find these external kind of objects and they are unfindable, so too when we try to find a mind that exists in the way that it appears, we can't actually get to that. It's ultimately unobservable if we're trying to find some sort of mind that has a real, true, ultimate existence. So here, just as with physical forms and so forth, which are and so forth are false, since the mind does not exist separately from the physical forms and so forth, which are false, it too is false. So just as physical forms and so forth possess various aspects and their identities are neither one nor many, similarly, since the mind is not different from them, its identity too is neither one nor many. So again, we kind of examine in this way, beginning with external phenomenon, then turning to the mind and see that the mind can't actually exist in this sort of autonomous, independent, truly existent way that it appears to us. And so the mind too doesn't have an identity as either one or many. Therefore, the mind by nature is like an illusion. So, like when an illusionist or a magician conjures up like horses and elephants and so forth, for those that are observing or watching this magic show, there's both the appearance of these horses and elephants and grasping at them as being real. We sort of apprehend them and have that kind of clinging to them as real. So, too, with the appearance of our mind and external phenomena. Now, in the case of that example, an illusionist may be able to recognize or understand that his illusions are not truly existent, but they will still appear to him that way. He just won't have that sort of grasping at them. But for us, all of this, our mind, as well as all phenomena, continuing into the next paragraph, analyze that just like the mind, the nature of all phenomena too is like an illusion. So although our mind appears to exist ultimately, when we search for it, when we try to find it, there's no such mind that exists like that. And so too are all phenomena. So as it explains here, they should be understood to be like an illusion.
oh yeah ta te dara shirab ji ngoni so so ta na se do shirab ji sim ji ngoni ta dam ba tu ba de me ta na ta ji se na ta dam ba ne sim nang do ya mi mi ne chiru do ya mi mi ni ga me ba ya mi mi ro ta dam ba ya ne de be sim ja mi mi se de be sim do ta dam ba mi ga ma ko de sa re so na ma be sim ja mi mi se ma be sim de ta da yin jung ju re mi ga ma re so na Tadar Junga ya mimi sosa. Tadar Junga te ya kawata gagbata nebala soba tere cheba chena. Ini jam tamba migmare sora. Sim kewe chaya kana ya me osa. Sim kewe chena rawe chuji shenda jine chu yonya yo maresa. Gagbe chaya rawe chuji shenda jil pandroya ke yo maresa. Sim ne sondo meba tendo meba suche mayimba osa. Semde gombe shebala soba tende ko sujen jene soye ke yo mardo ndire sheje ko tanya chim do sujen mayin bare sujen de jene tanya chi ordo ina ko ye de yo ordo o tiba de chilona ya
So, in this way, then, when the identity of the mind is specifically examined by wisdom, in the ultimate sense, it is perceived neither within nor without. So here we're examining whether or not the mind itself is really, truly autonomously existent. And one does so in this kind of, through this sort of examination and analysis. Now, is the mind perceived either within or without? And it continues, it is also not perceived in the absence of both. So here, one is investigating and analyzing, looking for the mind, and it continues this examination with wisdom by looking at neither the mind of the past, nor that of the future, nor that of the present is perceived. When the mind is born, it comes from nowhere. When it ceases, it goes nowhere because it is inapprehensible, undemonstrable, and non-physical. So if we try to identify or sort of locate the mind, well, where actually is the mind? We can't observe it sort of anywhere outside, nor can we find something even within the mind, because when we look at the individual moments of mind, well, is it the mind of the past? No, that's already gone. Is it the mind of the future? No, that's yet to come. Is it the mind of now? Well, that's constantly changing. And we would have to then look into, well, there's the arising of this present mind, and it's abiding and it's ceasing and so forth. And when one begins to investigate and analyze in that way, the mind is then becomes inapprehensible. It's not something that we can perceive as existing in this way that it appears to us.
Sobo mainge sobo le loso tendo meba kado meba ye meba rekja mainba dudu juba mainba chi yore do te sonja ko lüde sem da sa ge lüde de le ne meba cha ge lüde jawa meba cha ge na sem dan jawa meba cha ge yo mara tendo ko sem de le tene tak be da den ro yo ra lü jang jang ma do sem de loso to ya me do ne me so lüde de le de do ta ke wa chima ro ge me do sam ge yo ra Chimandona Ludi Mansha, Daya, Sobolton Dagiora. They designed to let the daughter, Chimandra, Kawaii, some door. I don't see them called Dag City Lud and Jamarwa. She lured Nanga Semra. Same day called Susan and she said to the Trubata, Tindemarwa, Pame Kudale Trubata, then the Rexa Yuba, Yuba, Royba, Tendezimarwa. This one's a called Tade. Ludan Java Shabby in a cosem that and drain and do. Now, Shakju to Simpe, Baruji Kage, Swan, Mega Shagdo. In a sim details and Shemaya, so in the Yandua. So Lule Zeshendo. You are Lula 10 day or Lula 10 day or the Lula Zeshendo, Sim de Daxi Bahakona. Any Ludi Mavachana, Sim de Yamdon Rongesu by some Koyora. The man and the Lud Daxi and meeting at that day legislature. I gave some of your Marsamancha, some editors, some Gora. Sako Lud and Sim Kaga Shekoya. Target Daxi Deliaco, Ludanja Mahige. Sim dan Soa dan the shit and what to do Susuma Druba, near you by the same good. Tishena called Dade supported the legi in a called supported and Joshua. Sim Tamosis and Teddy Yamdo. Not that you can send out drive over the shot to go or Tishilabna.
So here, when it comes to, again, this mind that we have, the mind, it has, when we try to search for, unlike the kind of form of somebody, and now generally when we designate, say, a person, we often do so on the basis of their form, but it's not on the basis of their form alone. We also are doing that designation on the basis of all of the aggregates combined. And so when we look then, in particular, at the kind of nature of mind, when we try to sort of look at what is mind, mind doesn't have any kind of physical form to it. There's no sort of color. There's no substantial thing that we can point to as being the mind. And so when it comes to sort of the basis for designating the I, it is both on the designation of the aggregates, but there's a content, again, our form aggregate is newly established in each life. So although there's no continuity between the form of this life and future lives, there is a continuity of our mental continuum, particularly this very subtle mental continuum that is supported by the body in a sort of conventional sense, but it isn't like of a single nature of the body. There is the physical and the body, and then there is the mind. And so the body can act as a support for the mind. But when we are speaking about sort of the basis of designating the self. Now, normally we tend to heavily associate that with the form aggregate, but really when we're talking about the kind of continuity of aggregates, including the mental aggregate that continue through multiple lives, we do so on the basis of all of those. And so when we are trying to talk about, assert that there is some kind of when we are trying to talk about the mind as having some kind of it being the basis of designation, we can say that this is, we can assert that it is sort of the basis of designating the self that continues through multiple lives. But this is based upon the understanding that there is a fundamental difference between form and mind. And here, this sort of mental continuity, and this is something that we can see, like when we're say going to sleep, where we pass out and there's our mental consciousness comes back even in those absence of consciousness. This is really an essential part of the basis of designation of the person. So we will then stop there for today, as the time has run out. We'll continue next week.
Thank you so much, Geshe, for these teachings, and also Katrina for explaining them, interpreting so well for us. Reminder to folks online that next week's class will be at 1 p.m. Pacific time. That's a one-time change, but it is next week, April 9th, 1 p.m.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of those songs, teachings, dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. In the snowy mountain pure land, you're the source of good and happiness. Powerful Tenzin Gyatso Chenrezi, may you stay until samsara ends.
Junja Jema Jeon, no?